Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. It's wonderful to see so many of you here to discuss this crucial topic, the future of religious freedom. I'm Jeff Rosen, the president of this superb institution, which, as one or two of you may have heard, is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful. You see, some of you have come to discuss the future of religious freedom, and you realize that our members are like congregants who exercise their free exercise of religious liberty rights to recite our congressional charter at every opportunity. We have so many exciting programs coming up over the next few months. Next Monday, October 2nd, we host former Governor Jeb Bush, former head of the National Constitution Center, to discuss the future of education at the annual Templeton Lecture. Coming soon after that is the Liberty Medal on October 19th, where Vice President Joe Biden will award the Liberty Medal to Senator John McCain for his lifetime of service and bipartisan sacrifice. And then we will host programs on the rise of populism abroad, talks with Bob Schieffer and Gold Star father Khazar Khan, as well as the historian Edward Ayers. It's going to be a superb series. We also have our great We the People podcast. How many people are listening to the podcast? You must sign up. You know that I tell you every time I see you to download the interactive Constitution. Listen to these incredible exercises in constitutional education, where you will hear the leading liberal and conservative scholars every week discussing the constitutional issues in the news. We just recorded one about hate speech on campus, and it was great, and learn from those wonderful events. And finally, our town halls are spreading across the country from Chicago to Dallas, and you can follow them online as well. We're so thrilled tonight to continue our great collaboration with the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy and the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Tonight's discussion, it kicks off the Andrea Mitchell Center's new programming season. And before I introduce our superb panel, I want to welcome Jeffrey Greene, the new director of the Andrea Mitchell Center, to talk about the center and our great collaboration. Please welcome Jeff Greene.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the kickoff event for the Andrea Mitchell Center's annual theme on states of religious freedom. We're grateful to be here tonight at the National Constitution Center and partner with this singular organization for this evening's program. And I want to thank the other sponsors of tonight's event, the Department of Religious Studies at Penn and the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, also at Penn. The topic of religious freedom is especially relevant today when, like never before, adherents of both religion and secularism must confront each other as permanent constituencies that have to be dealt with. Secularists, no longer as much as they once did, predict the gradual withering of religion in the face of modernity, but increasingly recognize religiosity as something that is here to stay. And from the other side, adherents of religion must confront atheism, like never before, as a pervasive competing context which, even if it does not undermine the practice of religion, increasingly conditions it. Given this nexus of concerns, the question of religious freedom could not be more salient. I want to thank Heather Sharkey, the program chair, for the energy and care she has devoted in spearheading the planning for this year's exciting theme. And I want to thank for all of their hard organizational work the other members of the planning committee, Ram Kanan, Jamal Elias, Sarah Gordon, Michelle Margolis, Melissa Wild, and Jolian Thomas. Tonight is a beginning not only because it is the kickoff of our theme, but because it's the first major event we've had in our new capacity as the newly named Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. For the last 10 years, our organization has been known as the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism. But as of this summer, we've received a transformative donation from Andrea Mitchell and her husband Alan Greenspan, which will permanently endow our existing programming as well as enable new initiatives. We're extremely grateful for their generosity and vision, and we look forward to sharing information about both our long-standing and our new programs, and would ask that if you're not already on our email list that you sign up today. This is also the first event where I speak to you as the director of the Mitchell Center. For the last decade, Roger Smith, the Christopher Brown Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Penn, has led our organization. I'd like to acknowledge Rogers at the outset this evening. It's really almost impossible to exaggerate the impact of his leadership on the vitality of the Mitchell Center or the impact of his example on all of us who share his passion for making this center a rigorous, inclusive, and relevant place of learning. Yet, in spite of all these changes, there's a great deal of continuity linking this year to the past. We continue to be led by the same great executive committee, many of whom are here tonight. We continue to profit from the essential administrative competence of Matt Roth. We continue to benefit from the sponsorship of those organizations who have supported us thus far, above all the Mellon Foundation, which launched us 10 years ago, and the Boyce Family Fund, which sponsors our graduate fellowships. And we will continue, I'm sure, to work together with the National Constitution Center and its distinguished leader, Jeffrey Rosen, to whom I'll now turn things back over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that wonderful collaboration. We are so looking forward to working with you and the center under its new auspices, thanks to the generous grant of Andrea Mitchell. And I too want to acknowledge Roger Smith, who's done such path-breaking work to educate Americans about citizenship over the past decade. Please join me in thanking Roger. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to Jeff and Rogers and the Center, we have a really superb panel tonight to discuss this crucially important question, and I want to introduce them to you now. Kristina Arriaga was appointed Vice Chairwoman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. On May 13th, 2016, you will have seen her at the National Constitution Center many times before. She previously served as Executive Director of Becket Law. She has been called a powerhouse by the Associated Press, the recipient of the Museum's Free Expression Award, and was featured appropriately by the Federalist as one of the 7 most amazing women of 2016. What a great award. Dan Barker is co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and co-host of Free Thought Radio. A former minister and evangelist turned atheist, he joined the Freedom from Religion Foundation staff in 1987, and his books include Just Pretend, a free thought book for children, Losing Faith in Faith, From Preacher to Atheist, Godless, The Good Atheist, Living a Purpose-Driven Life Without God. These are such great book titles. And Life-Driven Purpose, How an Atheist Finds Meaning, and finally, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. Wow, Dan, I want you to write my titles because these are really compelling. And finally, the great Rabbi David Saperstein is Director Emeritus of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and Senior Advisor to the Union for Reform Judaism for Policy and Strategy. Named by Newsweek as the most influential rabbi in America, and by the Washington Post as the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill, he directed the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, has been U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Kristina Arriaga, Dan Barker, and Rabbi David Saperstein.
Nice to sit in order. Good to see you.
Yeah, you're here. I'm here. You here. I'm going to be at the end. Yeah. Perfect. I'm going to shake hands properly with everyone as you sit down. Welcome. Great to see you. I'm so glad you made it, Dan. Rabbi, thank you.
You have another job in announcing anything.
As a carnival barker, yes, I do have another job, as the audience knows well. Well, we have a lot to learn about tonight, and I want to begin with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which Rabbi Saperstein had a role in drafting, which Kristina Arriaga has had a central role in shaping the application, and which Dan Barker has been an important critic of some recent applications. But to really understand the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, we need to go back to the meaning of the Free Exercise Clause. And your homework after this show is to go to the interactive Constitution and read the common statement on the Free Exercise Clause by 2 of the leading liberal and conservative scholars in America about religious freedom. And those are Frederick Geddicks and Michael McConnell. And in their description of the Free Exercise Clause, they talk about the genesis of RFRA. They talk about how the Supreme Court in the 1960s and 70s strengthened protection for religious liberty by requiring that government action that burdened religion have a compelling interest, how the Supreme Court shifted course in the famous Smith case of 1990, where the court held that the Free Exercise Clause doesn't relieve an individual of the obligation to comply with a valid and neutral law of general applicability. In other words, you don't get special exemptions because you claim that your religion forbids you from obeying generally applicable laws. And we learned that Smith was so controversial that in 1993, by overwhelming majorities, Congress voted to overturn Smith and reinstate the pre-Smith test, which said that you have to have a compelling reason before you allow a law to burden religious practice. So this law is now at the center of all the hot-button cases before the Supreme Court, from the Hobby Lobby case, which held that religiously scrupulous corporations don't have to abide by the Obamacare contraceptive mandate, to indirectly, although not directly, the cake case, which we're going to talk about, where a religiously scrupulous baker says that he shouldn't have to bake cakes for gay and lesbian couples. Rabbi Saperstein, you were instrumental in drafting this law. You are the James Madison of RFRA to some degree. So tell us about why you thought it was important to pass this law, how you helped to persuade bipartisan majorities in Congress to embrace it, and why you think it's important.
Probably the attribute of James Madison in this belongs to Doug Laycock, who played such a central role in shaping, and a number of others did. But I was proud to be part of the coalition, help head the legislative efforts of the coalition to get passage of the bill. You laid out what the fundamental concept is, that our First Amendment rights are rights that are not subject to majoritarian vote. They exist in and of themselves as an essential part of what it means to be a human being. And the concept of the founders was that religious freedom was a foundational right of conscience. It represented a fundamental aspect of the dignity and freedom of every person. We often refer to it as the first freedom because in the list of the Bill of Rights, the two religion clauses come first as a foundational right. In the Smith case, the court just abandoned it, and neither side asked them to do it. Neither side actually offered arguments on it. There were no questions in the court on it. Here, out of the blue, they simply talked. It's the idea of the compelling interest test, and tossed it in the garbage. And Justice Scalia called it a luxury we can no longer afford. And when he was challenged by the dissenters on the question of but doesn't that mean? And he said in his decision, if there's a rational basis, the government can pass a law. If you want to change, go to the legislature. And when he's challenged, it said, if you got to go to popular decisions of the legislature, minorities are always going to lose. And he said, it's the inevitable price of democracy. Inevitable price of democracy, the concept of fundamental rights is you don't go to the legislature. They're not subject to majoritarian vote in this regard. So in order to restore that legislatively, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed. I think in the main it has succeeded in what it wants to do. There are pieces of the criticism of how it's applied that Dan and I agree, but on the fundamental idea of it has played an important shield to actually protect religious freedom of worship and dress and all kinds of expression of religious identity. There I think it has really been a success, and on that I know that Christina and I would be in full agreement.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your service in helping to pass this law and for explaining it so well. Christina, the RFRA is now at the center of many of the most hotly contested questions involving religious liberty, perhaps most famously the Hobby Lobby case, which, invoking RFRA, held that a religiously scrupulous corporation didn't have to obey by the Obamacare contraception requirement. And in her dissenting opinion, Justice Ginsburg predicted that this application of RFRA would lead religiously scrupulous individuals to seek exemptions from a host of anti-discrimination laws, ranging from those prohibiting discrimination against gays and lesbians to others. Why do you think that Hobby Lobby was correctly decided, and why do you think that current and pending claims for exemptions from these generally applicable laws should be recognized in the name of RFRA and religious freedom?
That was a long question, but a good one. I mean, one of the great joys of working on First Amendment issues and the exercise clause and the establishment clause is that we get all these great cases, right? We deal with a lot of sex and drugs and religion. I mean, if you look at the most important Supreme Court cases, they all deal with these issues, right? So let's talk about Smith for a second, if I could take a short historical detour, and then I would love to talk about Hobby Lobby. The Smith case ended up being horrific for religious freedom in America. Let's talk about Al Smith, the main plaintiff. Al Smith and Galen Black they're still alive, two Native Americans who belong to the Peyote Church. And this group of Native Americans in Oregon have been consuming peyote as a sacrament for 10,000 years. And they have managed to live in the United States and be fruitful citizens. Ironically, they were both counselors for drug and alcohol abuse, people that were struggling with that. However, they consider peyote a way to find healing precisely for individuals who were facing and fighting addiction. And they were in Oregon, they consumed the peyote, and they get fired from their job for consuming the peyote. They go to the unemployment office, and they apply for unemployment benefits, and the unemployment office says, sorry, you violated the law, and as a result, you're not going to get unemployment benefits. The case goes, as Rabbi Saperstein said, all the way to the Supreme Court, and he deals with this issue. If the law is generally applicable, then there's no test for compelling government interest. So fast forward, so the Religious Freedom Restoration Act provides a test again. It restores what was called the Sherber test. And that test was brought out of a case of a woman who was a Seventh-day Adventist. She was a Sabbatarian. She wouldn't work on Saturdays. She was fired from her job because she wouldn't work on Saturdays. And the Supreme Court ruled, wait a second. Other people didn't have to work on Saturdays for other reasons. Why was she fired just because of her religion? Whenever you're dealing with conflicts, you have to weigh the burden that is placed on religion. So RFRA, we love acronyms, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, provides this balancing test again, and in come the family of Hobby Lobby, and in come the Affordable Care Act. The president decided, I shouldn't say the president, under the Affordable Care Act, there was a small segment that said that preventive services had to be covered 100% by the employer. This is a great thing. Mammograms, colonoscopies, certain cancer screenings. And then the Department of Health and Human Services decided that preventive care also included 20 FDA-approved contraceptives, 4 of which the FDA, the government itself, says may cause abortions. The Greene family are devout evangelicals. They have who has been to a Hobby Lobby? I had never been to a Hobby Lobby until I met the Greenes. They run an arts and craft retailer, and they had at the time over 26,000 employees. And they said, we have no objection to 16 of the 20. We only object to 4 because the government says they may cause abortions, only to 4. The government says, no problem. What you do is you pay us a fine of $1.6 million a day, and you don't have to pay for those 4. And they came back and said, but we don't object to any woman taking these. We just won't pay for these 4 out of the 20. The government said, no problem, see you in court. So they were in the lower court system. They went up to the Supreme Court, and the judges ruled 5-4 that the Greene family had established their business according to biblical principles. But more important than that, the Supreme Court decided that this compelling government interest was a false claim by the government because 1 in 3 Americans didn't have to comply with the same mandate they were imposing on the Greene family. The government had decided all employers had to pay for these 20 drugs, but they excused TRICARE, which is the health insurance for the largest employer in the world, the military. They exempted themselves. It's great to be in Congress, right? You can exempt yourself from things. They exempted Medicare, they exempted Medicaid, and they exempted New York City. They exempted anyone who had a grandfather plan. I don't know why they exempted New York City, but I'm sure there isn't some footnote someplace. Actually, New York City had grandfather its plan, and they covered no prescriptions. So when the Greene family went to court, they were portrayed as like rich family that wants to harm other people. All they wanted to do was continue to pay their employees double the minimum wage, which they were already doing, provide them excellent healthcare services, but not pay for those 4 contraceptives. So that's why they won their case.
Thank you for that great summary and the explanation of Smith as well. Dan, you are not a fan of the Hobby Lobby majority decision. And I'd like you to tell us why you think it was wrongly decided on constitutional grounds and why you are concerned that RFRA is increasingly being invoked to allow for exemptions from laws that shouldn't create exemptions, and why you believe that RFRA should be reconsidered or overturned.
RFRA is a bad law. My sympathies are with those peyote smokers. I understand they were doing it for religious reasons. I'm a member of a Native American tribe, the Lenape tribe, who were the original inhabitants right here. And I understand that there are religious differences in the way people live their lives. But these were drug counselors using drugs. It was a generally applicable law, and the decision was correct. They should not have been excused from a generally applicable law, because anyone else using drugs would also have to find another job, basically. So RFRA was then an attempt to do an end run around the Supreme Court's decision. And in fact, I think you said that it was by an overwhelming majority that it was decided, but my understanding is that RFRA had no public hearing. It was passed by unanimous consent, which is not a vote. In fact, no one can produce the actual vote from the RFRA, as far as I understand. Unanimous consent was just a quickly called meeting of Congress, and there was no name vote. And if there was, I'd like to see that. If there was a roll call vote on RFRA, in any event, RFRA was an attempt then to go above the head of the United States Supreme Court and say, we're going to make new law. We at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we think religious freedom is important, and we fight for that. And religious people join our lawsuits often because they understand the importance of the Establishment Clause. In fact, just today we got a decision out of Lehigh County, which is just north of here. They have a Christian cross on their county seal and county flag, and the judge who liked it reluctantly had to agree. The law is the law, and that cross has to go because there are citizens in the county who are harmed by that. So I think RFRA doesn't restore anything at all. The First Amendment guarantees religious freedom, and that is the freedom of conscience, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of belief, the freedom of the press, religious press, the freedom, religious freedom is a wonderful freedom that we were the first country in history to separate state and church. But the First Amendment does not include the freedom to harm others with your religious views. It doesn't include the freedom to say you are second class, especially if you work for the government or if you work for a place of public accountability. And so the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court has actually ruled on RFRA in the Bernie case in Texas, the Supreme Court said RFRA is unconstitutional. So then it turned into this, you know the story, this federal versus state law thing. How many states are there? 21 states now that have their own state RFRAs. Wisconsin, where I'm from, doesn't yet. So there were a lot of people who originally supported RFRA. ACLU and others and People for the American Way, but after they saw how it was implemented, they changed their mind. They have backed off because they saw that sort of germ idea that you're talking about to keep the state from overly burdening religious practices has been morphed into that innocent little don't burden me with my religion into more of a tool to discriminate against those who disagree with you religiously. And I think Hobby Lobby is discriminating. I think they are imposing their views. Those abortifacients were never even shown to be abortifacients. They had this religious view that they were, therefore they didn't want a part of that. So in a sense, they are impacting other people's lives with their religious views. That's un-American. You have freedom to believe, freedom to think, freedom to worship, but you don't have the freedom. You know, when we all went to first grade, we learned the basic principle of getting along in this country is my rights stop at the end of your nose, right? I have these freedoms, but I can't use them to bludgeon you with my religious views to make you, to deny you a cake because you're a gay couple or whatever. Although that's not really an Establishment Clause case. The principle is still a religious principle underneath that Baker's decision. So these poor religious conservatives are feeling like they're being discriminated against because they are not able to discriminate against others. And that's going way too far. RFRA did not restore anything at all. What it tried to do is amend the Constitution by expanding the First Amendment to allow religious people then to harm others with their religious points of view.
Thank you for that. So, Rabbi, you've heard Dan's critique, And he says that this was a law, RFRA, that civil libertarians and liberals initially supported, but has morphed into something that allows discrimination. And he mentioned this Cake case before the Supreme Court. Now, as he says, the Cake case is being argued under the free speech clause of the First Amendment, not the free exercise or establishment clause. But the basic facts are that a baker in Colorado who considers himself a Leonardo of the confectionery arts claims that his cake is a work of art, and that he should not be able to be coerced by the government into expressing speech with which he disagrees, namely endorsing gay and lesbian weddings. And that's going to be before the Supreme Court. Rabbi, this is a tough case on free speech grounds, but it does, as Dan suggests, raise this prospect that religiously motivated people might seek exemptions from general public accommodations or anti-discrimination laws. So as a supporter of RFRA, what can you tell us about your thoughts about the Cake case, and more broadly, what's your response to Dan's claim that this has morphed into a license to discriminate?
I know what it's like to be a moderator with three strong-willed
so you're going to ignore the question.
people here. If you'll indulge me.
I think Dan is my favorite frenemy right now, so I can't wait to have a chance also. So please.
If we could just do a little back and forth on this, I think it will help with that. Knowing your question that you just put there is where we're heading.
Yeah.
I think some back and forth will help clarify exactly what the issues are in the Master Cake case here.
Beautiful. Let me rephrase the question. Please respond to Dan.
No, actually, I want to respond to both.
Oh, okay.
So just to make this very easy to follow, Dan is right on Hobby Lobby and wrong on RFRA, and Christina is wrong on Hobby Lobby and right on RFRA. Got that? Now, here. So let me try to just explain as briefly as I can why I feel that way. First, a minor point. The House voted by unanimous consent. The Senate voted at three dissenting votes, mostly on the question of should it apply to prisons or not apply to prisons. It is a recorded vote.
But unanimous consent is not a roll call vote.
That's on the House side. I'm explaining on the Senate side. It was a roll call vote, so we know exactly who the three were who didn't vote for it. So the RFRA did restore the high watermark level of protection of the Sherbert case that was referred to before. If RFRA didn't exist and Smith, its weird case, had not been decided the way that it had, we would, just like the protections of free speech and freedom of the press and freedom of protest, all enjoy the same standard of the government needs a compelling interest to restrict it. And if it is going to restrict it, it needs to choose a way to restrict that right in pursuing a compelling interest goal in that manner that will least restrict the right involved. So, and that applies to all of them. If the free exercise clause had been still in effect exactly the way it had been for decades and decades and decades, you would have the same analysis in all these cases involving third-party harms that you have today. And I understand the sympathy about when we pass RFRA, we're thinking mostly about dress, about worship, about houses of worship, and where they can be built, and the eagle feathers, and the use of peyote. We weren't thinking about the third-party harms in the way that it would be used as a claim. You have a religious freedom claim to discriminate in some way against protected categories of people. But you would have had the same claims under the Free Exercise Clause, and in the main, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, we've won most of those cases. In other words, where the court has had to balance out is protection of anti-discrimination laws that protect African Americans, that protect Latinos as national ethnic groups, and Asians as a national ethnic group, that protect religious minorities, that protect these protected categories, and increasingly LGBTQ community, where people have made religious claims to discriminate. In the main, overwhelmingly, the courts have decided that there is a sufficient compelling interest that trumps the case. So I'm not sure what the problem is that we're trying to cure by saying do away with with RFRA. So we have a respectful difference on RFRA, and we get all the advantages of the things that RFRA has accomplished in other areas here. On Hobby Lobby, again, we have a respectful difference of opinion about this. In my view, I know this may sound a little strange, to going way out on a limb. Corporations don't worship. They don't have religious consciences. Here, they don't get involved in religious activities the way that we think about it. The notion, I mean, since Citizens United, giving First Amendment rights to corporations, I think has had devastating consequences on the commonweal of America and the well-being of America. This was just another case in that regard. I think the court was wrong in saying that there was a substantial burden on the corporation for having to provide the option of people to be to have the preventable issue of pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy, that they have a right to reproductive health care rights is a fundamental right that women have. And I don't think corporations should have the right to discriminate against people. That's what all of our discrimination law has been about. Think about it for a minute. If corporations, millions of them conceivably across the country, have First Amendment religious freedom rights that can actually be used to trump anti-discrimination laws, we have no schema of civil rights laws that are going to work in this country. It would devastate it. People would make claims affecting millions and millions and millions of minorities around the country and women in ways that would be deleterious to them having equal rights in this, in this country. It's bad enough with the laws that we fight this discrimination all the time. If they know that they can just make a religious freedom claim that they have an obligation or a responsibility to discriminate against protected categories, it would be a disaster. And one final difference of wording here that's going to be crucial to the master cake discussion here. You said that the court rejected the compelling interest argument of the government. The court actually assumed that the protection of the claim that the women involved in this case and those supporting the women's rights in this case, that protection of reproductive health care for women is a fundamental right. The court actually assumed that to be the case and made its decision assuming it to be the case. It could have said that's not a compelling interest. It did not do that. What you're referring to when it said there are all these other exceptions is the second part, the least restrictive means part. It said, if the idea is if you have a compelling interest, you have to pursue it, you have to do it with the least restrictive impact on the fundamental right involved. If you gave this out to all these other groups, to churches and houses of worship in the country and to all the groups that you talked about, you can give it to these corporations. And on that, they were probably right. If you have a least restrictive means and you're giving all these other exemptions and saying, oh, this can work fine with all these exceptions, then if the court had been correct in its conclusion that corporations do have free exercise rights, it was probably right in saying that least restrictive means you have to give them the same exemption that you give to other entities that you don't think will hurt the underlying law that's involved here. This is important because for me, the fundamental issue, and Dan and I agree on this, the fundamental issue is I believe our anti-discrimination law scheme in America is an absolutely bedrock, fundamental, compelling interest of the government. Therefore, I think in the main, it does prevail against those who have religious freedom claims that they have a right to discriminate against these protected categories.
So then,
Thank you for that powerful statement. I think I want to have everyone respond in turn. And now Christina to Dan and Rabbi Saperstein, but maybe begin, if you will, with his powerful claim that the rights of religious freedom, according to the framers, are natural rights that come from God or nature and not government. And in here, the rabbi said in the individual, not in the corporation. What is the response? That corporations are groups of individuals? And what are your other responses to the rabbi and to Dan?
This is a good panel already.
Yes, it is a good panel.
So a few things. You are right that the Supreme Court recognized that the preventive care for women was a compelling government interest. But remember that the final decision was very narrow. They did not say all corporations have these rights. They said family-owned businesses. And that is a crucial point in the case and a crucial point from the First Amendment. When someone starts a business, a family-owned business, you want to run it according to your beliefs. The same year that Hobby Lobby went to court, CVS decided they were not going to sell tobacco. Great, good for them. I'm anti-tobacco too. Many corporations decide that they're only going to deal with fair trade. It's true that corporations can have values. You don't leave all your values behind simply because you start a business. And that is a fundamental American principle. And that's what the Hobby Lobby family was arguing in court. The police cannot come and search your property simply because you're a corporation. Corporations do have some constitutional rights. And by the way, I am all about protected categories. I'm a woman, I'm Latina, over 50. So I am I'm against discrimination. But I also think the beauty of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is that it provides a balancing test. You cannot show up with a credit card that says religious freedom and immediately win the case. Let me take a quick detour of someone who's doing that right now in Michigan. Alan Dershowitz, O.J. Simpson's former attorney, and Mr. Morgenroth, who defended Jack Kevorkian for 15 years, have taken on the case of a physician who allegedly cut 2 girls, female genital mutilation, in this country. There are 500,000 girls at risk. And Alan Dershowitz argued that this small group of Shia Muslims had a religious freedom right to mutilate these girls. That is repulsive and it's dangerous. Absolutely, religious freedom doesn't win every time. It doesn't. So let's talk about the Pledge of Allegiance just for a second to make the point about the balance. The Pledge of Allegiance has been around since, I think, 1892. In some form or another, it was written by a pastor. And the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1940s, President Roosevelt signed a declaration, a flag act that included the Pledge of Allegiance. And one of our most famous religious freedom cases in 1935 has to do with Jehovah's Witnesses, the Gobitis family. And they had decided, the Jehovah's Witnesses here, by the way, down the street in Pennsylvania, had decided because their brethren was being killed in Germany for not saluting the flag or not saying the pledge in Germany, they would not say the pledge here. They felt that the Old Testament forbid it. I don't know if you know that in 1935, this is the way you said the Pledge of Allegiance. Not with your hand or your heart, but with a rigid arm. A lot of people were rightly offended by that. The Gobitis family goes to court, and the Gobitis family loses its case. The Gobitis kids, who were 10 and 8 years old at the time, were sticking their hands in their pockets, and the teachers were forcing their hands and making them make this sign to say the pledge. 1940, it was the height of patriotism in our country. 1943, only 3 years later, another Jehovah's Witness family decides to go to court, a case called Burnett, and they win the case. But what I love about the opinion in the case is something that was very clear. Justice Jackson, I believe, said, it is a fixed star, I'm paraphrasing. I'm over 50, I can't remember half of the things I did today. It is a fixed star on our constitutional constellation that no government official, high or petty, I think he meant lower official, not like a petty person, high or petty, has a right to declare what's orthodox when it comes to politics, religion, and nationalism, nor to force any citizen to proclaim this in their actions or words. This is what we're debating right now with the cake baker. Is it repulsive that some people think that other people, because of their sexual orientation, are second-class citizens? I think so. Absolutely. I think we all agree on that in this panel. But do they have the right to be wrong? Yes, and no government official should come in and tell them what to think about religion, politics, or nationalism, or to force them to do something against their will. to express themselves in a way that's contrary to their religious beliefs. The government has a role in limiting religious freedom and limiting free expression, but all the court cases that have been successful have made that limit very narrow. We call it strict scrutiny. We call it, in the Sherber case, it was called, what was it called, narrow? I forgot. In the Sherber case, what was the test? It was narrow.
Narrow tailoring or something?
Narrow tailoring.
Yeah.
Jeff knew it.
Hardly so.
So the point of this is that we as Americans, we're the most diverse country in the world, and we have managed to figure out how to navigate our legal system to make sure it codifies the American spirit. And part of it is living with people with whom you disagree.
Wow. Well, thank you, Kristina, for that incredibly moving story about the movement from Gobitis to Barnett. And I had not known that they were taking the kids' hands out of their pocket. And it was Justice Frankfurter, in one of his less successful opinions, who said, as a member of the most despised minority in history, no one could accuse me of being insensitive to the guarantees of the Constitution, but he was in that case more committed to judicial restraint. Dan, lots to talk about, but what's so exciting about this discussion is we're framing the cake case as a religious freedom case. Imagine that the cake guy were invoking the Free Exercise Clause and saying, I'm not a big corporation, I'm not even a family-owned business, I'm just an individual with a God-given right to the free exercise of religion, and the government can't force me to endorse a practice that offends my religion. Why shouldn't he win?
Well, let me respond to that, but first let me continue with Barnett. Just last week, my granddaughter, Mika, in the Frank Alice Elementary School, she's in 3rd grade, she told her teacher, I don't have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance because, and I don't want to. And the teacher said, yes, you do.
But the teacher was wrong.
She was wrong, but she said, yes, you do. And in front of the whole class, she told Mika, and we just found out about it last week. She told Mika, you are unpatriotic. People gave their lives and their freedoms, and you were disrespecting veterans. Even though her father, my son, is a Marine veteran, she was telling her this, and she said, I don't have to. And she's pretty brave, little 3rd grader. And the teacher said, well, you need a note from your parents that you can be exempted from this, right?
What state is this?
This is Wisconsin, and it's just one class, all right? So, yesterday...
The chairwoman of the U.S. Commission is taking note.
So I told Danny and Mika, that's wrong, unconstitutional. One of our attorneys sent a letter to the school district, and the superintendent said, yeah, this is wrong. So Wednesday morning, what's today, Thursday? Yesterday morning, Mika saw the principal come into the 3rd grade class, and then she overheard them talking. And the principal was pretty firm about that. You can't do that. And in our letter, and of course quoted all the legal precedent, no governmental official, high or petty, even in a 3rd grade class, has the right to force people to stand if they don't want to stand. That's, freedom of speech means freedom not to speak, right? I mean, so it's both, right? So Mika's pretty happy, and we're trying to caution Mika, go easy on your teacher. Your teacher didn't know. I mean, don't be, don't be bragging, because the teacher's feelings are probably pretty hurt too here, so. But who knows, Mika's her own person, and that's good. It's usually the minorities, it's usually the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Jews and the atheists and the other religious minorities that have to take these cases. And when we take our cases, we are almost always joined by religious people who agree with us. So it's not just like atheists suing the government. But I also have a second business. I play professional piano, and so I play for all sorts of things. And sometimes I get called to play at a religious wedding. And I will play, as an atheist, I will play these religious songs to solemnize this wedding. And when I'm doing that, I'm considering I'm a professional. This is not me speaking. I'm doing a job for these people, right? I'm doing it because they want their wedding to be meaningful. I'm not going to get up there and say, this is stupid, there's no God, and Jesus is a myth, and you shouldn't be doing... that's their wedding.
Wait, do you wear the A, though? The A?
Well, the A could be American, or it could be... So it's hard for me to do that. It's hard for me to go into church as a professional pianist, and most of my jobs are secular, but I realize that when I am speaking as a hired person, I am not expressing myself as an artist. I'm expressing their views. And I think the cake baker should have the same attitude. When the cake baker is a place of public accommodation for people who come in, anybody who comes into that bakery should expect to be treated the same way. When that baker makes a cake, that's not the baker's expression. That's not the baker's speech. That's the expression and the speech of the people who ordered the cake. And if the baker doesn't like that, the baker should go into another line of business.
Rabbi, it's going to be your turn to respond to this and the baker, but I want to put on the table also another big First Amendment controversy is hate speech on college campuses. You've been a leader in opposing international laws to ban blasphemy, which are essentially based on the same principle that would ban hate speech here, that these laws offend the dignity and sensibilities of the religiously scrupulous. So tell us about what you think about the cake, and then about why blasphemy is not a good thing to ban.
Well, I just want to ask Dan a question about what he said. What you said about playing, supposing you were a singer, and they asked you to sing songs that you truly had religious objections to.
I've done that.
I understand that, but do you think someone who sees differently their role, just as an individual, not talking about a corporation here, a professional gets paid for it, do you think that if somebody really feels, look, they're asking me to sing a song that I genuinely believe religiously it's wrong and offends my deepest held religious principles, do you think that they have an obligation to do it? Some of these cases, particularly with artistry, are very, very close cases in terms of pitting the religious freedom claims of the performer, the creator, against the people here. But in the main, Dan and I agree, if you're going to be a corporation, and Christina, I know you want to have it both ways. Though, how many people in the audience here are either lawyers or have ever been a lawyer or served as a corporate executive? Raise your hand. All right, so you know full well that the entire raison d'etre of a corporation was to separate the individual and this legal entity that was being created, to make sure that if someone was going to sue this business enterprise, it could not get at the individual. The entire concept of it was to separate the two. And I understand that there are closely held corporations that are primarily family run, but the entire structure is to do it, except when it comes to making religious freedom claims to discriminate against employees or others here. And I find that deeply troubling. I think that case was just wrongly decided here. In the Master Cake case, I think in general what Dan explained is correct, that you're dealing with, this is not the same kind of artistry. People ask for what the kind of cake that they want, and the people do it. And when you go into business as a corporation, and then you are subject to public accommodation laws. And if you make the argument, artistry, then what about the person who makes the clothing? What about the person who's going to do the hairdressing? What about the person who's going to prepare any of the food that's involved in the catering? Do you want to say to these people, if you have a religious objection against providing services to blacks, you don't have to have blacks come into your store. Or Latinas, you don't have to have national ethnic groups that you're offended to. Or Jews, you don't have to have Jews, or serve them or provide services to them, etc. The entire schema of public accommodation laws and civil rights laws is to say you go into business like this, you do not discriminate against these protected categories. And I think that has made America a much richer, much better country in this regard. And I understand the legitimate claims in Master Cake on both sides of this. I really think that the protection of these categories of the LGBTQ community in this case, there is a sufficiently compelling interest that you cannot discriminate against these people simply because you object to their being married, which is now a fundamentally constitutional protected right
but of course,
in this country.
At this point, LGBT is not an enumerated civil rights class
but on the question of, the objection was to marriage, not that they said very clearly, we would not discriminate against these people. They came in and wanted to buy something because we're objecting to the marriage part of it. That is a constitutionally protected right at this point. After Obergefell. Yes, we're in agreement on that?
All right.
Okay.
But Chris,
I mean, it should be. I'm saying it should be.
Kristina is not in agreement, and you said it was low to note the idea of refusing to serve Jews and Latinas. Tell us why you were unpersuaded by Rabbi Saperstein's take on the master cake case and how you think it should be decided.
So let me ask you a question. So you would force a member of the LGBTQ community who's a photographer or a cake baker or an event planner or a dressmaker to go and work at an event for Westboro Baptist Church? Westboro Baptist Church is a famously homophobic church. They blame everything on the LGBTQ community. They go to military funerals and they said they're killing us because we have accepted gay people in this country. Would you force a gay photographer to go and photograph that event?
Complicated issue. Because you threw it into photography. Let me go back to the cake. All right. If you ask me.
So you're saying cake is a lesser art?
Hang on. Here. If you're talking about should a baker have to provide a cake the way that they want, even if they had enormous agreement to it, I think yes. And I think that the image, a reasonable observer would not see that cake in that place as being the expression of the views at Westboro Church, being the expression of the views of the baker who made it. They would see it as the expression of the views of the Westboro Church here. So I don't think that those free speech rights are implicated in the same way. I think the Elaine photography case, the photography case is a much closer cause because of the artistry that I indicated. And what I'm fearful of is that if somebody is hired to provide their artistic abilities to in music or something like that, and people don't think they did a good job, they're going to end up getting sued for discrimination against the category they have here. So I think these are very on the cusp, very complicated cases.
Well,
but on Master Cake, the fundamental principle of is it a sufficient compelling interest to say a business cannot discriminate against the people they're providing services to? In the main, I think that prevails.
Well, I'll make 2 quick points. One is the race card. Race has a different place in our society. We went to war over it. Horrible things were done in the name of race. I don't think we can compare what happened, the horrible things that happened to the African American community in this country since the founding, to issues having to do with the LGBTQ community. I really don't think so. I think the LGBTQ community has, whoa, this is great. Passionate audience. The LGBTQ community has suffered great injustices, but I don't think you can compare the African Americans to the LGBTQ community. And then the other thing I'm going to say, I'd rather go to jail than bake a cake for the Westboro Baptist Church, and I would hope you would come and get me out and defend me.
I absolutely would. Out of fairness to what Christina was saying, let me just say it a little differently. There clearly is, because of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, there is a history that race has been treated differently in this regard, and has this kind of higher protection that courts generally have given it to other protected categories. So if you said the same thing without getting into the LGBTQ thing, that discrimination against a Jew or a Cuban would not be as high as the protection is. It's not the same as the African American. Then you might not get to the same reaction. I think that's what you were.
Okay, I must have misphrased it. Thanks for defending me already. They're both identity issues, right? And the great Doug Laycock, who argued the Religious Freedom Restoration Act case, who argued for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and argued in favor of chicken sacrificing Hialeah in the very famous Supreme Court Lukumi case, said very recently that these are identity cases. This is at the core of who we are as a religious person, who we are as a sexual person. They're to the core of who we are, and they cannot be treated in ways that are dismissive of either claim. So what he has argued for is always a balancing test. There's never one side that wins automatically when they raise the claim of one side or the other.
We are, I think, collecting your questions on note cards, but we have a few more really important issues to discuss in this wonderful panel. And I want to ask you, Dan, about the Johnson Amendment. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has sued the administration. The case is called RF versus Trump. attempting to enforce the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits nonprofit organizations, including ministers, from endorsing or opposing political candidates. President Trump said that a key priority was to totally destroy the so-called Johnson Amendment, and he signed an executive order which directs the IRS not to take adverse actions against churches that participate in political activity, and FFRF has sued. Tell us about the suit and why you think you should win.
We sued on the very day he signed it because there was anticipation that that executive order was coming down. We didn't know the exact wording, but our attorneys were ready. So on May the 4th, on the National Day of Prayer, which we also think is unconstitutional, and we challenged and won in court over, although the Seventh Circuit overturned it on standing, that we were not injured, basically. They didn't rule on the merits. The Johnson Amendment is good, and it makes sure that all nonprofits, it's the bargain you strike with the government. You're going to be a nonprofit, and if you give money to a church or a charity, that's different from giving money to a political candidate. You get to write off your charitable donations to the Red Cross or to your church, but you don't get to write them off to your political candidate. That's different. So, in fact, an awful lot of religious institutions support the Johnson Amendment because they don't want their churches involved in politics. They don't want their pastor or priest telling them what to do. But that was part of Trump's big campaign, is I will repeal the Johnson Amendment, he said. So we sued, and then the government in their brief basically admitted that Trump didn't understand what he was signing, because Trump's own administration, if you read the briefs, said, no, this does not overturn the Johnson Amendment, and it doesn't change a thing. It turned out that what Trump was doing was window dressing. He was just trying to give something to the religious right, to say, I'm going to do something for you. And you might have seen that ceremony in the Rose Garden where all these religious leaders were around him, and he made a big show of, I'm signing, now you're free, now you pastors are no longer hampered and you can say what you want. Well, that's not at all what the executive order did. We think, besides, what authority does the president have to undo an act of Congress, right? So there were a lot of reasons in that, a lot of reasons why we sued. And we think what it does is it's like a wink-wink. So a lot of churches who are even already flagrantly disobeying the Johnson Amendment by getting up and hoping the IRS will challenge them so that they can take the court, they're already saying, well, we can do this now. We can get up and tell our parishioners how to vote. We can put this who to vote for on the marquee out on the church lawn. The reason we can sue is because his executive order targets religious people, saying to them that, directing the IRS to ignore them, but not us. So we are not being treated the same way. Any nonprofit is under that. If the Freedom from Religion Foundation were to get up and start telling people what candidates to vote for, you can bet they would clamp down on us. Us unpopular groups, the IRS would really shut down quickly. So I know there's a move in Congress now to undo the Johnson Amendment. That's a whole different thing. So we're trying to bring light to the value of this, the value of everybody being treated the same in this regards.
Rabbi, you've testified in favor of maintaining the Johnson Amendment. You've said that lifting the partisan politicking restrictions are not just bad legal policy and bad public policy, but bad religious policy as well. Tell us why. And then I'm going to ask you a related question I'm eager for the answer to. At Rosh Hashanah last week, I went to a synagogue in D.C., and the rabbi just tore into President Trump. And it was a very political sermon. And he wasn't endorsing a political candidate, but it was a very political sermon. And it didn't sit well with me. I'm the head of the Nonpartisan Constitution Center. Just as a matter of religious policy, is it good for rabbis to be so political?
First of all, you've given a compelling rebuttal in the way you shape that to the president's argument, along the lines that Dan was saying. People have, clergy have freedom of speech right now. They can do whatever they want from their pulpits. They can criticize policy. They can criticize political officials. They can criticize even candidates in certain ways. What they can't do is endorse or oppose a candidate for office and get a tax deduction or tax exemption for their institution that they're leading if they're doing it on behalf of the institution. They can, by the way, they can do it as an individual person. There are many prominent pastors who have served in the Congress of the United States, run for office, served in Congress in the United States while they are heading a church. They just cannot use a penny of the church's resources in order to do it. And what you described is eloquent testimony to the freedom of the pulpit that people have. It's a bedrock principle of religious freedom here. Is it wise to do it? You're caught on the horns of a dilemma. People don't like to come up with sermons they know are going to be divisive to their congregations. On the other hand, almost all major religious faiths share this sense of a prophetic witness they have of speaking truth to power. And that is a very powerful idea here. And when a political figure acts in a way to divide the country, when a political figure acts in a way to give a stamp of approval to injustices, or implements policies that people feel violate the core religious principles, they have a right on the pulpit to speak out. They have to balance those two tensions every time they decide to address these issues. There were many rabbis across the country who spoke critically of the president's, particularly his divisiveness, his coarse rhetoric, his stamp of approval for coarse rhetoric, his stamp of approval indirectly for extremists in the country, as well as differences on policy, and felt that at this time, when they had the largest number of their congregants there, they had a moral responsibility to speak out on these issues. I'm proud of those people that did. I understand those who chose not to do it.
Just one quick addition, is that okay?
Very quick. I've got so many great questions.
Overdoing the Johnson Amendment would turn churches, which are already not accountable to the public, into PACs. All this money could go into a church for political reasons, and we would have no accountability for that. So that's another one of our objections.
It is. Right now we have all kinds of exemptions. We don't have to report 990s and where our money comes from and what happens to it and stuff. If you allow our money to then be used for political purposes, either the government's going to create a loophole that will swallow all campaign finance laws, or it's going to start regulating churches in ways that is going to change the role and special protections that religious groups.
And you might have to report 990 if we win our 990 case.
Well, that one I found this.
Before we go to these phenomenal questions, I do want to hear Kristina on the Johnson Amendment.
So you want to have it both ways. You want to make sure that a rabbi, a priest, an imam can speak on issues of conscience, but then he can walk up to the line but not cross it. I agree with you. But the problem is, who draws the line? 3 years ago, the IRS had a program where they were sending people, government officials, to churches and synagogues and mosques to figure out if the sermon was in violation of the Johnson Amendment. Now, who loves the IRS here? Because I don't. So a government bureaucrat with, I assume, minimal training on what constitutes political speech would sit in the back pew of your church to figure out if your pastor was violating the law. That's the problem. It's the applicability.
Really
yes.
I mean, that actually happened?
Yes. In Cuba, we have the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. Every block has a person who monitors if people are being loyal to the revolution. And the same thing was happening here in the United States. And that was revealed during a Freedom from Religion Foundation case when someone had intervened and they found out about this program. That is a problem with the IRS. That is a problem with the Johnson Amendment. And that becomes a problem for the free speech of individuals who have a moral duty to guide their congregations to moral decisions.
We have so many great questions, and the first must be from Roger Smith. And it's a wonderful Jeffersonian question. Should rights of secular moral conscience get the same strict scrutiny protection as religious conscience? If not, is that equal protection? Dan, that sounds like a question for you.
So should secular values be treated the same as religious values?
As a constitutional matter, should they get the same strict scrutiny as religious ones?
Yeah, atheism's not a religion, but legally under the Supreme Court, it kind of has the place for religion. Atheism, for example, doesn't have creeds or missionaries or commandments or clergy or it's just the absence of a belief. But if you're going to go to court and argue that your belief or lack of has been challenged, and it's treated kind of legally as if it is a religion, and there are some people who think so. But the founder of our group, Ann Nickel Gaylor, said, and this, of course, is very true, that you can't have religious freedom without the freedom to dissent. You can't say yes if you can't say no. So if there's discrimination against non-believers and atheists, then it would be the same thing, I think.
There's so many, I'm going to keep throwing them out, and if you want to go back, you can. Comment on the Trinity Lutheran decision from June, how to balance the idea of not discriminating because an organization is religious with taxpayer funding of religious organizations' playground. Rabbi.
This was a case that over the last 30, 35 years, the court that in the high watermark era of separation of church and state, we've been talking free establishment, has said a core part of the establishment is the government doesn't support religion. And it has begun to chop away on that in terms of if what's being provided is not religious in content, like a text, a mathematics textbook, it could give it to a parochial school. If you're talking about, let's say, tax deductions, that can go to a religious entity as well. But it began to say in-kind contributions can go to, so if there is leftover product from agricultural programs that can go into feeding programs that the churches run for hungry people, you can give them cheese for them to use. And the last major one was the Helms case that said you can take computers, so long as you don't use them for religious purposes, you can take computers. But until Trinity Lutheran came up, never had the Supreme Court ever upheld a program that transferred dollars from the state to a church. That had been the firewall up until that case. This case dealt with a playground. And the court said, if a church is part of a broader program that is available to other nonprofits and other kinds of schools, and they can get it for their playground. And the question was, first time that money, cash money could go, and the unknown question is this limited to something like a playground, or is this opening the door now to say anything that a non-religious school could get, a religious school could get, or a nonprofit could get, a church could get? We don't know the answer to that. In the case, the majority said cash can go for the first time for the playground. On the other hand, with the two dissenters and three who joined in the now famous footnote number 3, saying we are only talking about playgrounds in this case. It appears to be that there is still a narrow majority that clearly doesn't want cash dollars to be going to anything that has to do with the running of religious life per se. But we don't know what the court gets, and what the court will do is always a difficult challenge.
But was it cash? It was recycled tires.
Was it the actual recycled tires, or was it the?
They got the recycled tires.
I think there was actually the money to purchase.
Oh, then I have to reread it. So. I thought it was the monetary value of the recycled tires.
Because under Helms, there wouldn't have been such a big question if it was just the recycled tires, right? I mean, Helms would have resolved that. So
that's the state issue. The state also had something called a Blaine Amendment. And those are amendments, there are about 37 states now that have these Blaine Amendments that were born out of bigotry against Catholics. And basically they said, no one who is involved in anything religious no one sectarian, meaning Catholic, can receive any state money. And then this has been interpreted in different ways in different states. But the fact is, being a religious person does not contaminate the book you're touching or the computer you're using, and it doesn't contaminate the playground. Kids who happen to be affiliated with a church wouldn't have contaminated the retired tires either. There should be neutral treatment of religious schools when it comes to these programs that are available to everyone.
Since you're
Except
talking about
all the others don't have an establishment clause, and religious entities have an establishment clause, and I think that's one of the things that has made religious freedom so strong in America.
Since you mentioned it, Christina, would you join Justices Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, who didn't join footnote 3 and seem willing to overturn the Blaine Amendments and allow much broader funding?
Yes, absolutely.
Tell the audience why.
I'm sorry?
Tell the audience why. What's the constitutional argument?
I think that homeless shelters that happen to have started because religiously inspired individuals wanted to provide the homeless shelter or the hungry food or prison programs should not be banned from receiving assistance from the state if they go to the same programs. I mean, in the state of Florida, for instance, there was a program called Prisoners of Christ where they would go to the bus stop where the prisoner had just been relieved. They would pick him up. They would give him a bag of clothing. They would give him a home. They would give him shelter. They would teach him how to get a license. They would teach him how to get a job, how to put a resume together. And they provided the services. The state of Florida, they were sued by activist atheists out of New York, not you, other activist atheists. They were sued, even though the activist atheists didn't say, hey, bring the prisoners here. We're going to take care of them. They didn't say that. They said those prisoners cannot receive those services because the state is giving $12 a day per prisoner. The Prisoners of Christ Foundation, the charity, was providing the rest of the services. And the state of Florida joined the Prisoners of Christ and said, please, the greatest services that we have for prisoners are because of religiously inspired people. Now, to be clear, that money never touched any of the religious programs that they offered. You could volunteer to join the afternoon prayer or the reading of the Bible. You didn't have to participate in any of those programs. The rate of recidivism was much better. The state of Florida wanted Prisoners of Christ to stay. The case was in court for many years, and finally, the Prisoners of Christ won the court case.
But what a lot of people want on I hate to say on the right, but what a lot of people want is to be able to use that money for religious programs. They argue the strength of these programs is the religious content of them, and therefore they want to get it. If you want to have any kind of social service program, and you are going to separate the religion out, here for the secular part, and we advise that you separately incorporate it so it protects the church. Here it makes clear it's a secular entity that doesn't discriminate in who you're serving. Here, and I believe we differ on this, doesn't discriminate in who it hires with tax dollars, and run it as a secular program. We agree you can get that money. The only question is where what the court used to call pervasively sectarian entities, houses of worship themselves, if it gets it, or a parochial school, if it takes government cash, religion's so infused with everything in that institution, you really can't separate it. But for the secular program that Christina was describing, at least she and I don't know what Dan is on this, she and I aren't agreed that you can get government money under the conditions that I indicated.
And I agree there should be a strict separation. By the way, no person should be denied services contingent on their religious beliefs. And that's one of the conditions for the funding, and I agree with you. And by the way, people on the right, people on the left, there are people everywhere. I am interested to find out why you're harmed by the National Day of Prayer.
Well, we're talking about something else first here. Money.
Yeah, but I was super interested.
Let's talk
in
about
answer.
it. Money is fungible, so it frees up more money for worship and religious purposes if they don't have to pay for it. I think this is a case of where religion gets the credit, but the taxpayers get the bill. If I were running a religious charity or a church or something, I'd be embarrassed to admit that my God wasn't big enough to provide our needs, that we had to go begging to the tax dollars. Benjamin Franklin said something very much like that, and again, I don't have the exact quote, but he said, when it's a good religion, it will support itself. But as soon as the religion needs to start asking for the support of the government, that's a sign that it's failing, that it's not a good religion.
You know, again, it depends what you mean by religion here. If you're talking about core religious activity, then that's one thing. Religious institutions, affiliated institutions, are amongst the largest providers of social services in America. In the main, they are provided without discrimination to who they serve. They're provided in secular terms. In those conditions, they are allowed to get money. And the notion that because it is religiously inspired, that you can't get government money for a secular program, just like any other secular program, is one that makes no sense to me at all, and we really just have a profound difference of
They're already getting tax breaks. Trinity
But the-
Lutheran is getting tax-free money.
So does every secular nonprofit that runs a program.
But the
so-
Blaine
Thank God.
Amendment in Missouri, the Blaine Amendment was very specific that no money shall be drawn for the Treasury for the support of any religious purpose.
Which is why you and I were on the same side of that case, because the playground is part of the church. So you and I were in agreement. It shouldn't have gotten it, but the court narrowly said you can when we're talking about playgrounds. We don't know what the implications will be in the long run on that.
Last word to Christina on this
Religious
case.
nonprofits in this country provide $1.3 trillion to the economy. $1.3 trillion. And I don't know about you guys, but would you rather go to a hospital that's run by the Little Sisters of the Poor, or what was the name of the famous Jewish hospital in New York? Or
Mount Sinai.
Mount Sinai? Or
Absolutely, I want to go to Mount Sinai.
Yeah, or a government-run entity. I mean, like, one flew over the cuckoo's nest. That's all. I'm leaving you with that image.
We have a whole bunch of cake questions, and most of them are skeptical, so I'll give them to Christina to start. In the cake baking case, what's the difference between not baking a cake for same-sex couples or for a couple that's African-American? Where is the line? Making a cake with a swastika? And in fact, I think a baker did refuse to bake a Hitler cake not long ago.
That's right.
As the cake artist did not agree to the objective wording or the cake, how can this be a violation of free speech or religion? And finally, if the cake baker can express personal religious sentiments, what makes it wrong for an individual manager in a big business not to do the same?
Okay. So the first part of the question is baking versus not baking, doing versus not doing, saying versus not saying. Our free speech provides protections for what we say, but it also provides us protections from being compelled to say something. That is two sides of the same coin when it comes to free speech. I'm not a baker, I'm a cook. I happen to believe that baking a cake is an expression of art. I think that is someone insulting to the poor cake bakers of America. There are 100 cake baking shows. I think it's an extension of who they are. I think it's an expression of themselves. And I think absolutely they should be able to say yes or no. Are there limits? Absolutely there are limits. There's a whole range of 50-year-old civil rights laws that prevent the cake baker from saying, I will not make it for you because you're African American, you're Latina. Title VII protects certain, or because you're old, or because you're whatever. But it certainly says that the cake baker should be protected from having to express himself in a way that he or she does not want to express herself. And frankly, this is a market issue. Like, if I'm Latina, I walk into an establishment and someone says, I'm not going to bake the cake because you're Latina, I'm not calling the big mother government to come in and say, find that person. I'm going to go, the heck with you. I am not coming back here again, and I'm going to lobby against you, and I'm going to tell all my friends about it. Why do people have to call in the government into a scenario when a person doesn't want to provide services for a same-sex wedding?
Every store, every business that has ever discriminated against somebody because of their national origin, because of their religion, because of their sexual orientation makes the same argument. It's a market issue. Let them go find someone who will do it. And again, I do think some of these artistry things, I just draw the line differently than you. I think the cake, the hairdresser, the person who makes the wedding dress, even the photographer are on one side of the line. I think the singer who has to perform is on a different side of the line.
But who makes that decision? Who makes the decision who's an artist?
We make decisions like that all the time, and they're made either in the law or by the courts in weighing it out. But this is a balancing test, as you said. I balance it that way. I've tried to explain why here. For me, it's very narrow when you can really make a religious claim that would result in discriminating against a protected category. And I think it's one of the things that makes America great.
And when you have a place of public accommodation where the doors are open, where anybody can come in, then the civil rights law says you can't discriminate.
Right.
In my case, and maybe in a photographer case, it might be different, as we're kind of like independents. I can just say, no, I won't take the job. I mean, it's not like they're walking into a business, and a photographer can just say, no, I'm busy or I won't take it. But if I were to tell them, no, I won't take this because I hate your views or because I'm prejudiced or
Not your
racist.
views. Here, because,
Yeah, because of
So
that.
the cake baker, again, there's in Colorado a case of a cake baker that makes pot-themed cakes.
Makes what?
Pot. I tried marijuana at the last panel. No one understood what that was. And pot, with my accent, no one knows what pot is. Weed.
This is the National Constitution Center. No,
Yeah.
hallucinatory substance that can
Yes,
cause.
okay, hallucinatory substances.
And what do you think we do here?
Some guy showed up and said, make me a weed cake with the Confederate flag. And the guy said no. And I'm like, I'm with the guy that said no. I also don't want my kids to ever know where this bakery is. I mean, it's legal in Colorado. But if he doesn't want to make the Confederate flag with the weed inside, why does he have to? And yes, it's a part of expression. And I think what happens with many of these things is we have preconceptions. And again, the LGBTQ community has suffered greatly, and they're having so many injustices against that community. And it's only recently, Obergefell, that it's legal to get married. I understand what their issues, but it comes at a great price to force someone to doesn't want to do it, to do something for you, because what they are doing you don't consider to be a form of art. And that is condescending and patronizing to that guy who thinks that it's a form of art.
Explain to me how you differentiate that against someone who says, heartfelt, I feel the same way about Jews. Explain to me the difference.
It is a huge difference. It is a huge difference.
Which is?
Because again, race issues in this country hold an entirely different place than sexual orientation issues. And it is, love this crowd. I believe.
Answer from a constitutional perspective, because I
From
think
a
that'll help them
constitutional
understand. What has the
perspective.
Supreme Court said about the difference between racial discrimination and religious discrimination, and that against women
Well,
and gays and lesbians?
in the Bob Jones case, the Supreme Court ruled that no one can claim that they have a religious objection to interracial marriages. And as a result, making that claim became unconstitutional. No?
Making a claim didn't, but you can make the claim. You lose because
Well, you can make a claim. It's unconstitutional.
Yeah,
It's a
right.
compelling interest of this country to make sure that race continues to occupy a special place in our
But
discourse.
we're talking about Cubans and Jews. Why should, it's someone who has an objection and doesn't like us. Why don't they have a right to say, I'm not going to serve them in my store. I'm not going to bake a cake for them. Do you think they do if they really have religious objections to us?
Cubans are the Jews of the Caribbean, first of all. I wanted to share that with you. So we're in this together. What was the question again?
Why don't they have a religious right to say, I really am offended by the idea of serving Jews who don't accept Jesus as a Messiah. I don't want to serve anyone.
But the thing is, again, it's the balancing test. That person has to sincerely believe that and go to a church that believes that Jews are going to hell or Jews crucify Christ.
And if they do, then they can discriminate?
I would say that the court would rule against them. I think it would be very hard to prove sincerely
and I think the
held
court should
religious
rule
beliefs.
against them. So here's some.
I have to comment about your remark that it's a market thing and that if they can just go to another baker. I mean, couldn't you make the same argument? Rosa Parks would have got to the destination wherever she sat on that bus. She would have got there. So what big deal if she sits in the back?
No, I think it's an entirely different argument.
But it's the principle's the same. She would have got there. She was told to sit in the back. It was a dignity thing. She was being treated differently. She wanted to ride that bus. And so somebody wants to go to that baker and being told they can't. What's the difference, as Rabbi is saying here?
Can we move to another
No,
topic?
no,
I mean,
no,
I'm
no.
happy to continue talking about race. I still want to know why National Dare Prayer hurts you, but...
In fact, there's only one divine law at the National Constitution Center, and that is that panels have to end on time.
Oh.
So, ladies and gentlemen,
7:30.
Thomas Jefferson believed that the right to worship or not to worship God according to the dictates of conscience was a natural right that came from God or nature and not from government. And only by vigorously testing our beliefs, by listening to opinions with which we disagreed, could truth emerge. This panel has been a model of that sort of Jeffersonian discourse. Thank you for shedding light.
We should shake hands.
Wonderful. Great job.
Yeah, you're
Really
great.
excellent.